Okay, Dad, today is Monday, July 1st. You have a good weekend?
Not a particularly good one, but I got through it all right. It was,
Okay.
yeah,
All right. Well, we won't dive into why it was
yeah,
a bad weekend.
nothing very dramatic or interesting, really. It's just, yeah, not nearly as exciting as what's going on in the world. What we're going to talk about.
Okay, yeah. So, what we can talk about, I was thinking we can dive a little bit into just the who's running our country question. I know
Uh huh.
this, I don't want to get too political. We're more of a geopolitics podcast, but
Yeah.
after that debate and just seeing the gaslighting from a lot of the Twitter space, the Democratic Party Twitter saying that, Biden still got it. I saw a Newsweek article that said independent voters are still are flocking to Biden now. It was just kind of
Yeah.
strange. It's like they're doubling down
Yeah.
on this thing, but then it just
Well,
anybody
but
that's
yeah, a lot of the establishment is not supporting him. They really have turned on him. And no question about it. The New York Times, editorial said time to go. Um, and
right.
that's
Well, I don't know if they can let him go because it sounds like the Biden's family, Jill Biden and Hunter
right.
Biden, are really, which just seems like that's not what you should do with your husband and your father. It seems pretty
Right.
wrong.
Right.
But they're just wanting to save their own skin, maybe. But anyways, we won't dive too much into personal attacks on the Bidens. But just the bigger question on tying it into geopolitics is who is running America now? It doesn't seem to be Biden. Like, is America even capable of negotiating with somebody like Putin if Biden is the president?
Yeah. Well, um, I guess you can't quite say that, he's not running things, but obviously he's going to be much more removed, much less involved in the details and day-to-day affairs than the average president. I mean, some presidents tend to be more hands-on. Other presidents tend to delegate more authority, and both approaches can be successful, right? I mean, I mean,
Well, I would say in the situation we're in now, a hands-off approach is not what we want. We need somebody that's willing to talk with world leaders, right? I mean,
right.
do you think a hands-off approach is acceptable in this
Um,
situation?
no, obviously we should have a vigorous, engaged, knowledgeable, president. There are a lot of crises, and yes, and that's not, yeah, obviously that's not the kind of president that we have right now. Yeah, so what we have is we have a foreign policy that is being run pretty much by the State Department, by I think Anthony Blinken in particular. And I think, to be honest, though, that his thinking is pretty much in line with Joe Biden's thinking. It's not that he was chosen because they were of one mind. And so I don't think there's really much of a divergence. If Joe wakes up one day and gains a mind that's 20 years younger or something, I don't know that we would see a big change in policy, to be honest. I think that the people that he has in charge do reflect his thinking, all in all. Um, but yeah, there's really nobody there captaining the ship. We have different policies that are on autopilot. So, I guess one thing is just, the chance that there's going to be any real reassessment. I don't think it was great to begin with, but it's probably even less likely that you have like the various agencies, institutions in charge. I mean, it's less likely that they're going to change their the course that they're on right now in any significant way. Um, so long as they're autonomous. So, the institution
Well,
will continue to be the institution and will continue to, pursue the policies they've always wanted to pursue. A president, has the authority and I think has a greater freedom to make adjustments, at least to policy, maybe to set a new course, and that we don't have somebody, obviously, who's really capable of doing that.
right. I mean, can this peace negotiation succeed and proceed without Biden ever picking up the phone? Like, could we reach and negotiate a peace deal with Putin without any
Right.
communication from the president? Is that
Well,
even
that is a
possible?
problem. That's a good point. Well, first of all, I don't think there's really a chance in any case. But yeah, I mean, if it's just a further complication, it's a further obstacle to any kind of deal that you don't have a competent president, because I mean the Russians look over there and they say, who are we supposed to talk to? Do we make an independent deal with the State Department? But that doesn't have any particular authority. The Secretary of State could be fired the next day, and it doesn't mean anything. That agreement that we made with them just doesn't mean anything, beyond his tenure. So, yeah, I think like even in the best case scenario, with a vigorous and alert and engaged Biden, the chances of a peace deal would be very slim. But I mean, without a president at all, there's really, again, you're the Russians. Who do you talk to?
Do you think the reason that Biden doesn't want to talk with Putin is, well, one, he hates Putin, but also do you think he's maybe a little bit afraid to talk to him? Do you think Biden is aware that he can't communicate and that's why he's kind of hidden from sight most of the time? Like, does he talk to world leaders at all?
Well,
I mean,
that's
other than
actually,
just our
I think
allies?
actually, right. That's a good point. That reminds me of an incident that took place at the end of 2021, when Putin was reaching out, was, sounding the alarm and saying, hey, we need to talk. We're he's basically warning that a war was coming. And he did get Biden on the phone in December of 2021. And Biden actually agreed. This is according to Ray McGovern, the very high-ranking CIA analyst. Biden agreed not to place nuclear missiles in Ukraine. He said, okay, that's something we can agree we won't do. Roughly a month later, apparently, Anthony Blinken just walked that back and said, well, he didn't really mean that. We can't make that promise. And that, it's been said, may have contributed to the start of the SMO more than anything. It's like when they say, when the Russians realized, that we don't have any guarantees. We thought we had one. We thought Biden said so, right? But now they're telling us that no, his agreement didn't mean anything. We simply can't allow this possibility to exist. Missiles in Ukraine, just minutes from Moscow. And that may have been the spark, that put Ukraine on fire, set it ablaze.
Well, Anthony Blinken, he is a Democrat. He's supposed to be a very cultured person. He grew up in France. And how did the Democrats and people like Anthony Blinken become such, such hawkish, pro-war people? The Democrats were supposed to be an anti-war party.
Yeah.
How did that switch happen?
Right. Well, that's, it's a great mystery. It's true. There was a time when the Democrats were the anti-war party, right? The ones that favored diplomacy. And now we have a diplomat that seems to actually be opposed to diplomacy. He's about issuing ultimatums and threats of various kinds, right? I think it's, again, it's kind of that the Democrats. Well, one thing is, they've really been the establishment, certainly in the media, and for a long time. And they're the revolutionaries. Let's say there was a certain radical wing of the Democratic Party, that arose during the '60s, and it was very much anti-war. But it made its long march through the institutions, and then, it used to be an outside force within the Democratic Party. You could see that like at the 1968 convention, it was the radicals who were rioting in the streets. But eventually those radicals made it into the halls of power. And now, it's those radicals that run the that have their hands on the levers of power, that are the Democratic establishment. So I think part of it is like once you become the establishment, you tend to look at things differently. Well, now we're in control, and we control this military machine. Isn't it great? We can go punish our enemies. I mean, I think that's part of it. But then it's also a reflection of this, let's call it this hegemonic disease. When that unipolar moment was something that, this knowledge that we were the sole superpower and that we could simply, act as we pleased, that we could use our military power, without fear of repercussion around the world. I think that was intoxicating, and it was intoxicating to Democrats as well as it was to Republicans, and it's just something that they haven't. That's the way they started to think. Basically we're the people in charge. We issue the orders, right? And it's just like those that oppose us. The way to deal with them is simply to punish them. And that's a mindset that developed, over time, but especially I think, like towards the end of the last century. And it's a mindset that these people just seem to be unable to escape from. I mean, it's just that even as the world has changed in fundamental ways, they no longer have that power. They cannot act without restraint because their rivals have risen. But it's just something that they refuse to see. They don't want to see, and they continue to act as if they still were living in the 1990s.
Is there any solution for this? This it just sounds like you're saying, this power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Yeah. And so when anybody gets elected into the halls of power, they're just going to start, taking advantage of these military machines and go after people. What's the solution? Is there, because we just have two war parties. It's like you could vote for war or more war. That's not
right.
That's not good.
We don't really, we really don't have much of a choice here in the U.S. Some countries there may be a choice, there may be a possibility. We can, I guess, talk about it later of going down a different path, but it seems like there's just one path, that our elites are willing to tread at the present time, and it's this same hegemonic path, that's just going to insist on being the hegemon. It's just though the evidence that this policy is failing and is failing in spectacular fashion is just piling up before us, but still they don't want to see it. And part of the problem is that when you have this, maybe they've lost their power to actually do things in the real world, especially beyond America's borders. Witness what's happened in the Red Sea with the Houthis, witness what is happening in Ukraine. But they still have tremendous media power, both internationally, but also especially domestically. So, you can do things. You can, your policy can be just a total flop. Like so much of like well, I think the best example is the sanctions war against Russia, a total disaster. But you just haven't had the media like holding their feet to the fire. There should be a lot of questions. Hey, what's happening? Why isn't the ruble rubble, and so on and so forth. You have a very compliant media that was more than compliant. It's just it collaborates in maintaining certain fictions. So and covering up the failures of U.S. policy, and that allows them to continue down this course. I think the role of the media in all this just can't be overestimated. And then you have people, of course we have alternative media now, but most people don't make the effort to search it out, and they just kind of lazily pick up the stories that are fed to them, through Facebook or Google News or whatever. And all that is going to, reinforce the illusion in the sense that, basically we're still in charge. That, all our opponents are some combination of let's say, barbaric and stupid.
Do you think the media can be saved? Is there any salvation there? Or
Well,
are
yeah.
these institutions, now that they've gone down this road of being just a propaganda arm of the government, can they admit it and cut back? And are they able to recover the reputations that they once held? Or is it
I
done?
don't see much of any hope for the mainstream media. I was thinking the last couple of days after the debate that, well, you know, it was quite startling how quickly they turned on Biden and said, "Oh my God, this was a disaster. The guy is clearly senile, not fit for office." And they say, "Wow, it's like, the this alternative democracy, a vibrant democracy, and everyone there is a patriot who's." Who just wants America to send in some more weapons so they can go to the front and fight those evil Russians. Now, those of us who are in the alternative media, we see these videos every day. I mean, just every day they come out, and of people being tackled in the streets and being wrestled down, pulled out of bars and cafes and pulled off buses and to taken to these recruitment centers. And they're hard to watch because you really feel for those guys. I really find them hard to watch. And then often, like a wife or a mother or the father is president, and they're doing what they can to try to save, their kid or their husband, and it's but you have no recognition of this. It's so obvious that this is something that's going on. This is something that should be a major news story. Occasionally, it trickles through, but it's just on the edges of the mainstream media. But just in general, the opinion leaders don't, act as it doesn't exist. So I was thinking, well, could we have a moment like we did with Biden, where they say, "Oh my God, what's going on?" And their eyes are opened. And I realized that no, because the case is okay. I think the Biden panic happened because they realized that they couldn't achieve their objective with him. They started with, "Oh no, we're going to lose the election, and we're not going to defeat Trump. And that's something that we have to do. So we got to jettison this guy and find somebody else." So it's a part of it. It's a means to an end. They thought that Biden could be a tool to achieve their objective. And when they realized that he couldn't serve that purpose, they all of a sudden started, well, like we have the hysteria that we have now, right? But like in the case of Ukraine, they don't care. I mean, these guys going to the front, that's their objective. They want them to go to the front and fight. That's what they're there for. So I don't think we're ever going to have a moment like that. I think, it just seems like what I'm saying is just in general, they're committed to these various projects. That's what they're about. And their job in the whole thing is to maintain the narrative that supports the project. They made an adjustment to the Biden story when they realized that the project was in danger because of Biden. But otherwise, they wouldn't have done it. So I just don't see any hope in the mainstream media. I mean, the hope, of course, is the alternative media. And that's, it still doesn't have the numbers, but it's there, right? All of us are just chipping away. And eventually, it's clear, part of the recurrent hysteria, within the Western establishment is about disinformation and so forth. It's obviously something that worries them. The fact that there is this alternative media where you can hear stories that, haven't been approved, that don't support the official narratives. So that, that is something. I just don't know if it'll ever break through. We'll have to see.
What we're doing in Ukraine is just so unbelievably cruel. If you think just, I heard that about 2,000 Ukrainians or more are dying every day on the front, and they're fighting a war that they don't want to fight. Like you said, they're having to pull people off the streets. I see these videos too. Like I saw a video of a new father with his wife, an infant son, and they rip him away from him and his wife and his kid, and they throw him in a van. It's just, and he's just going to most likely die within a couple of weeks. They only get a couple of weeks training, and they send him to the front line. Yeah, it's just so crazy that this is what we're supporting. Has there ever been something similar like this before, where we see, where a proxy is forced to sacrifice its whole country for a war that clearly they can't win?
Yeah.
And it's just,
No, it's
it's
right.
so unbelievably cruel.
Right. Right.
It's,
Yeah. Well, it's just right. I mean, it is. No, I can't think of anything. I'm sure there are historical precedents, but I just, in the last several decades, I can't think of anything like this. It's just right. It's not just the stories, not just the videos that you see all the time of these poor people being just pulled off the streets, but then there's just the fact that they're swimming across the rivers, hiring people to take them through the mountains. People, they're handing over their life fortunes or family fortunes just to escape. I was thinking the other day, I guess, like during the Cold War, it was John F. Kennedy made a very famous speech in Berlin, when he said that, well, we don't have to build a wall to keep our people in. And he's made a very valid point, right? I mean, that was true. I mean, it wasn't that the Westerners were trying to escape into East Germany. It was the other way around. And I think that is very telling. People will say all kinds of things in opinion polls, but what really tells you what people believe, what matters to them, is like where they go, where their feet take them. And in Ukraine, people are not trying to get into Ukraine; they're trying to get out of it. It's just, and we're part of this effort to keep them in. Actually, and more than that, to force them, basically to shackle them and send them to the front lines. This is, it's a horrible, really, I don't think the horror of it really can be exaggerated, but there's just a complete lack of concern, and just almost no reporting on it whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, we're even trying to get Ukrainians that have fled the country to go back,
right.
Don't reissue them passports. I even saw the Israeli government made an announcement saying if you're dual citizens of Ukraine and Israel, don't go to Ukraine because Ukraine will not let dual citizens leave the country. If you're a man, they will keep you there and they will send you to the front line because they're scraping the bottom of the barrel, and you will most likely die. Right. in something where you're not even fighting the Russians at this point. You just get shipped off to the front line, and then a 3,000-pound glide bomb lands on you and wipes out your whole platoon. That's what happens. It doesn't even seem like they're even fighting the Russians that much. Like, do you know the Russian casualty numbers? I mean, there's some that get killed by FPV drones and stuff like this, but I'm hearing it seems like the Russians aren't really experiencing hardly any casualties anymore,
right.
And
I think
the Ukrainians are skyrocketing.
Right. What we have, the Russians don't report their own casualty figures. They did that a little bit at the beginning of the war, and then they stopped it. But the best source, I think the most reliable source for Russian casualty figures is by this MediaZona project, which is actually done. It's a collaborative project jointly run by the BBC and MediaZona, which is an opposition group, an anti-Putin group in Russia. So, I mean, these are two very, obviously not friends of the Russian government, right? They have every incentive really to exaggerate the casualty figures, and through their research, which consists of actually going through obituaries, visiting cemeteries, reading local papers, and so on and so forth. Trying to scrounge up or locate every last death that was linked to the SMO possible. They've managed to find, last I heard, and maybe a little bit higher now, that they had found a total of 55,000 Russian fatalities.
Is that for the whole war?
For the whole war, right. And that, that's significant. It's approximately equal to, what the Americans suffered in all of Vietnam. But the important thing, that's important, but another important aspect of, of their findings is the general trend. And the trend has been downward for the last several months. There were two peaks, one, I think, during the first month in the initial phase of the SMO, and the second during Bakhmut. And there were last year there was a small peak at the beginning of the Avdiivka campaign, but since then it's been dropping steadily. And I think, for the last several months, in fact, the Russians have been experiencing suffering fewer casualties than any other time during the war.
Do you have any idea what that would mean on a per average day basis over the past month or so? Or
I don't know, but it could vary. It's probably, I would say it's double digits or something, like
really under 100.
Yeah,
as opposed to 2,000 plus for the Ukrainians.
For the 2,000 figure we get from actually the Russian Ministry of Defense, and they've been, reporting their estimates of Ukrainian casualties. Now it's not just killed; it's killed and seriously wounded. Killed basically, people that have been put out of action. So I don't know exactly what the proportion is, how many of those are killed, how many of those are wounded. But what you can see from there is people can argue about the accuracy. I tend to believe them. It's just that the Russian Ministry of Defense is actually very conservative and careful about what it says. I'll just give you an example. I think it was just yesterday, or it may have in fact been today, that they announced that the village of, I think it's Alexandrovka, or, something like that. I'm not great with these names, but just north of Ocheretino, had been captured by the Russians. Now, that is 2 weeks after the British Ministry of Defense announced the same thing. They actually said, oh, yeah, this village has fallen. But the Russian Ministry of Defense held off until finally today, because they're very, very conservative. So, they're not out there trying to get the positive news out. They just want to be absolutely sure about what they say. They were waiting, I think, for some territory to the south of it to be captured, and then they could say, okay, it's just completely secure. There's no chance that the Ukrainians can ever take this back. Now we'll announce it. That's their general approach. Very cautious, very conservative. So I tend to believe their figures. And now and then in any case, you can see what like the relative casualty numbers. You're going to get an idea of what which battles, which areas are resulting in more casualties, and which places casualties are fewer, and over time too, you can see trends. And what you see, there's a very obvious upward trend. If you went about a year ago, maybe a typical day was under 1,000 total. I remember back, it may have been not much more than a year ago, where it would be maybe 500 total in a day. Now we're getting, like you say, up around 2,000. And there's been a definite upward trend, and it seems to be accelerating, over these last few weeks. It was just maybe a couple months ago, we're down around 1,200, now we're up at 2,000. And, it's a sign that things are really starting to break down on the front for the Ukrainians. I think it's a reflection of the chaos there, the people that are being thrown into the trenches without any training.
Well, so this 55,000 number you got, how could people look that up themselves? Because I always see people saying that there are 500,000 Russians have been killed, and, you get so much anti-Russian propaganda on Twitter. So it's hard to know, when you say a number like 55,000, how do you back that up, or can we look that up?
Yeah, well, it is, it's been published, I guess at various times through the BBC, and I'm sure MediaZona has its own website. I haven't, bothered to go directly to it. I should. I'll make a point of doing it after this.
So, Google MediaZona.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll let you look it up and make sure.
Okay.
But I think it's important for those to try to give the sources for that, because people throw numbers out constantly, and but then it's obviously, I think that's I have this a similar worldview and position that you do on this.
Right.
But it's
just kind of anecdotal. Again, your sister's there in Moscow, knows a lot of different people, a lot of Russians, and nobody knows anybody that anybody that died on the front. It's something that's not affecting daily life there. I'm sure there are probably certain villages or towns where there are more people, that a higher proportion of young men that have volunteered, and you're going to, those places are going to be more affected. There's no question about it. Moscow is a pretty liberal city. By Russian standards, it's very liberal, and there's not as much support for the war. Or there's a lot of support for the war, but people aren't as willing to go out and fight. So
always the country boys in every country that want to go.
Right. But I remember it was a year ago. There was a survey was done of the Ukrainian population, and they found out what the majority of Ukrainians knew at least 3 people who had died, and that was a year ago. I mean, it's obviously affecting. Well, you can see it with these videos. Why are these people so terrified? They know what's happening, right? Their president can lie as much as they want, and their news agencies can lie as much as they want, and Westerners who want to believe it will believe what they say, but the Ukrainians themselves know.
But this can't go on for much longer, right? I mean, if you have to round up people on the streets like this, if they're not inflicting any real casualties on the Russians, if they're losing 2,000 men a day, everyone's fleeing. Like Ukraine is collapsing in real time now. It seems like, right? And you're starting to see some signs for Zelensky's talking about we need to do another peace summit. We need to negotiate soon. He's making moves. So do you think that will happen? But obviously when we're negotiating, the negotiation's not going to be between so much Ukraine and Russia. It's more between the United States and Russia. And like we said at the beginning, who does Putin talk to?
Right.
There's nobody to talk to. Anthony Blinken, I don't think, has talked to Sergei Lavrov, his counterpart, once in the past 2 years. Putin, Biden clearly is not talking to Putin, and he won't talk to him, and he's not really even capable of talking to him. So,
right. Again, it's right. I was making that point, back in December 2021, Biden agreed to it, and then Blinken just walked it back. It's just sort of like.
So does this mean that Ukraine will just keep on fighting until maybe Zelensky gets assassinated and the whole remaining population turns on the Ukrainian establishment, and or they just have to keep on going until they're all dead or until the election is over?
Yeah, right. I don't know. Yeah, it just seems like I don't know what's going to happen, but you're right. It seems like things can't continue as they are for much longer. Recently, there was some story about a coup attempt in Kiev. That there was some sort of uprising was planned, and the Ukrainian SBU, claimed to have captured the plotters. And then there's talks about, Syrskyi, who recently replaced Zaluzhny as the commander of the armed forces, that he may be fired. There was another general that recently was fired. There's this, obviously, this government is not very stable. I don't know, it just might go on like this for who knows how long. But at some point, either we'll just pull the plug, or Ukraine will implode.
I'm just thinking in the future when the history books are written and they look back on the Ukraine project, what happened in Ukraine, it's just going to, I don't think there's any other word for it but evil, what we've done to Ukraine, what the U.S. and NATO has done to this country. And it's, and it's just so crazy that even saying what we're saying right now somehow says like, oh, you're carrying water for Putin, you want Russia to take over the whole world. We have to make sure Ukraine's victorious. Nobody steps back and talks about what does victory look like to you? If everybody's dead, is that victory? Are you happy? Because that's what we're almost at right now. Ukraine is a destroyed, hollowed out country at this point. Do you know how much of the population it's lost, in terms of people that have fled and in deaths?
Right.
And it's got to be getting close to half the country is gone.
Right. Yeah. Certainly many millions have fled. Who knows, maybe 500,000 deaths. It's hard to know at this point.
Well, are you able to say anything about Zelensky and his push for wanting to settle this conflict? He has been, talking about that a bit now. So what does that mean?
There's been an obvious change in tone. You're right. I mean, first of all, I think it was about a week ago that he made some statement about how this really can't go on much longer, and Ukraine is suffering,
Right. He said a lot of our men are dying now. He was openly admitting like everybody's
right.
dying.
That's something that he just never said before. I mean, that is a real change of tone. So I'm sure, it does indicate something. And then there's talk about, expressing openness to negotiations. He said, well, we can't talk to him directly, of course, because he himself had a law passed preventing any Ukrainian from negotiating with the Russians. He said, if we find the right intermediary. So
who would that intermediary be? Could it be China? It obviously can't be the United States.
Right.
It can't be any Western NATO country.
Right. I don't know. Turkey has played that role in the past, but they blew it in the case of those negotiations over the Azovstal steel plant. If you remember, there were some of those officers, the far right extremists that were taken prisoner by the Russians. And part of the deal was actually they were sent off to Turkey, but they're supposed to be held there until the end of the war. And then Turkey just handed them over. So I think they kind of, how can the Russians trust them they were supposed to keep their part of their bargain. That was, an intermediary is supposed to be trusted by both sides.
When he said Turkey just handed them over, you mean they handed them over to Ukraine?
To Ukraine, yeah. Right. Just to garner favor with Ukraine in the West. So I don't think it could be Turkey. I don't know.
Okay, well, maybe this question: do you see actual diplomacy happening in the near future, or do you think that it's not possible because of the situation in Biden in the West?
Right. Well, there's a real problem. First of all, there's a problem that like who's in charge in the U.S. and the Russians, I think, have made it clear they feel like they do have to negotiate with the U.S. because they understand that the U.S. without the U.S. Negotiations don't really mean a whole lot because in the end it's the U.S. that is calling the shots, in Europe as a whole and in Ukraine in particular. But who are you going to talk to? We have a president that's really not there. So if there's no president, what do you do, right? And then you have this problem of trust in general. There's the Minsk Accords that were reached, back in like 2015. It later had different leaders involved in the negotiations and who were signatories to the Minsk Accords. Hollande of France and Merkel of Germany, Poroshenko in Ukraine, all saying that it was just a ruse. They were just pulling the wool over the Russians' eyes as a way of it was the delaying tactics so they could build up forces in Ukraine. They were never serious about it. Well, the Russians hear this and say, well, we'd be idiots to go, to negotiate with you again, especially after what happened with the negotiations, the Istanbul negotiations in March and April of 2022. They thought that they were at least on the verge of an agreement there, and so they agreed to a ceasefire. They pulled the forces away from Kiev, and then the Ukrainians, really at the urging of the UK and the US, just tore up the agreement. So and with those experiences, they have every reason to be very suspicious, and to be very reluctant to believe in any sort of negotiations. It's just like we tried the negotiating route and both times we were burned. And, like Putin himself has said that he made a mistake to trust the West. He was a fool. And a lot of people at the time actually, within Russia were saying you shouldn't trust him. It's kind of like, I think it's analogous to like what happened in Iran. You had the reformers in Iran, go pushing for these negotiations with the U.S. and the West, over their nuclear power program. And the hardliners said, you can't trust him, right? But eventually an agreement was reached. And it looked like, part of the agreement was that the West, the U.S. in particular, would start removing its sanctions from Iran. Well, the Iranians kept their part of the agreement, but the West didn't keep their part of it, and then eventually tore up the whole agreement. And so again, like, where did that put the reformers in Iran? I mean, it's like in both cases, the hardliners were, you have to say, were proved right, right?
Can't trust the West.
Yeah,
That's
yeah, I
what we
mean, really.
become.
So exactly. So what do you do? Say, I think at this point they really, I think the chance for a negotiated settlement is very slim. I mean, first of all, you just don't see any real awareness, on the West. Sometimes you hear murmurings about some sort of negotiation, but it's so far from what the realities on the ground, and what the Russians are saying they need, that I don't see them as very significant. Zelensky is starting to murmur something, but he's still saying that, he hasn't actually admitted that he would soften any of his requirements. So I first of all, there really isn't much to see on the Western and Ukrainian side. And then the Russians just have every reason to be extremely cynical about any sort of olive branch that might be offered them. So I think that they probably came to the conclusion that we just have to do this ourselves. In other words, we're going to have to just create our own buffer zone. We're just going to have to go some certain distance west until we feel safe, and then they'll stop there. That's what's going to happen.
So how does this end? Do you think that it will just create a buffer zone? They move forward and they say that the Dnieper and plus 100 kilometers past or something like what is?
Right. Well, I think
will Ukraine continue to be this cold kind of Cold War type of thing that maybe there's a ceasefire, but they're building up forces and you got North Korea, South Korea style.
I know some in Russia and Mark Sloboda says that he thought that it would never come to this, or at the beginning of the war he thought, well, they're definitely never going to go into West Ukraine. Nobody wants to go into West Ukraine because unlike in East Ukraine, the Ukrainians in West Ukraine actually do hate the Russians. That's part of what they're all about. That's a big part of their identity is just hating Russians. And so you just don't want to be ruling over these people. It's going to be a mess, right? It's not going to be ugly. But he thinks that the Russians might not have a choice because they can't just have this anti-Russian state that's constantly being armed by the West right there on the border. And they just may be forced to go all the way to the Polish border. So he may be right. But then again, maybe the Russians will decide, well, it's just better to live with that. It'll be greatly weakened if we take all of East Ukraine and South Ukraine in particular, Odessa, and they don't have access to the Black Sea. And that makes it, right now they're making things difficult for the Russian Navy because they do have access to the Black Sea. But if they're denied that, first of all, it's going to be a real blow to the Ukrainian economy. And then second, it'll also make them, it'll reduce the threat, reduce the harm that they can do to Russia if they have control of the southern part of Ukraine.
Okay, so how do you think this ends? And will it end soon? Like we said before, we can't go much longer.
It's very hard to predict. We've said that we see signs of just like the growing, let's say, crisis along the front lines. Both the increasing casualty levels, and then the accelerating. You have to say slowly accelerating, but I think still you have to say accelerating advance of the Russian forces. They're recently they've broken through in some places on the line that were static for over 10 years, like at Torsk in New York. There's actually a little town called New York, right?
I saw a headline, something like Russia bombed New York. I was like, what? I was like, I knew there was a retaliation, I knew that, but I wasn't.
Yeah. Right. But that's actually quite significant. That's a place where, it was just static. It was one of the most highly fortified, or one area with the strongest fortifications, along the entire front. The kind of like Avdiivka, where the Ukrainians had built up these fortifications over the course of more than 10 years, and there was just hadn't been any movement there. And but apparently, because of the crisis, like up in Kharkov, they stripped the frontline units there of a lot of forces, and the Russians saw, what had happened, and they struck, and they have actually, made quite a bit of progress. It's been very rapid, and they're entering the city and surrounding New York, entering Torsk and surrounding New York. They did another one of these infiltration via pipeline attacks. If you remember in Avdiivka, they found a pipe. They spent, I think, months clearing it out. It was like full of junk. And then they sent special forces through there, the special operations forces. And it went, maybe it was a mile up the pipeline, then came up out through a hatch and took the Ukrainians by surprise in their rear there. And that was a big part of the fall of Avdiivka. Well, they did the same thing. They actually traveled 2 miles through this pipe and then popped up in the rear of the Ukrainians and immediately seized a big chunk of territory.
Well,
so, but anyway, that's just an example of how, it's, you can't say the whole line is crumbling. There are places where the Ukrainians are really dug in and they're fighting hard. They're suffering terrible casualties, but they're at least slowing the Russian advance. So the Russians are maybe just advancing 100 meters a day or something, but they're still advancing. But in the meantime, because they've concentrated on holding these places like Chasiv Yar or Volchansk, they've been forced to strip forces in other areas, and the Russians are finding these places and pushing through suddenly, making sudden advances, and then all at the cost of very high Ukrainian casualties. So, we just see sort of this. It's not. Maybe it's sort of like a collapse in slow motion. But it may speed up suddenly at some point. That's the way these things work. They go slowly until they go very fast, and it's very hard to predict that day. When you reach that tipping point. It could be 2 weeks from now. It could be a month from now. We've forecast some sort of major Russian offensive. I think that the Russians have made signals that they're going to do this. And it may be when that offensive comes, they're maybe going to time it where they feel like they're point where the Ukrainians are about to collapse, and then they're going to push real hard, and we may see the collapse then. That could be a couple of weeks from now. It could be a month.
Morale, right?
Yeah, it could. I think I would just say that who knows, but I think, like by the end of the summer, definitely we'll see it. Okay. I think we will.
Okay. Well, Dad, I think we can probably end it here, unless there's any updates you want to give for Israel and Lebanon, Gaza, Palestine.
Well, there's certainly a lot of things to be said about that, but nothing in particular. It still seems like the Israelis are preparing to launch an attack on Hezbollah. You see videos of armored vehicles heading north. They seem to be quite serious about it. It looks like it will happen. It could be any day now.
There's so many things happening. The hard part is being able to focus on which one, that are kind of chipping away at the American empire.
Yeah.
I also want to talk about the U.S. economy and public debt and how much longer this can go on. But we'll save all that for another time. I think we can stop it there then. Okay. Thanks a lot, Dad.